Hello, everyone. I'm Karen McNeil, author of the Wine Bible and editor of the digital newsletter Wine Speed. And this is a live virtual tasting on what well may be the most underrated wines in the world. I'm talking about the dry table wines of Portugal. I am a huge fan of Portuguese wines, and I hope that after this session in which you're joining us, I can make you a fan too, if you're not already, which I suspect many of you are. But thank you for being here. We're so happy that you're joining us today. And I want to start by saying, before I introduce my very famous guest, that Portugal is something of an enigma. It's of course part of modern Europe, and yet at the same time, it's a country very steeped in history and tradition. Whenever I go there, I feel like I've stepped back into a world 100 years ago. And the wines, of course, are sensational. Let me tell you who's here with me. Rob Symington is a member of the 5th generation of Symingtons, the Symingtons being the world's leading producers of port and table wines from the Douro region of Portugal. Rob heads up the marketing team globally, and he's also spearheaded many of the family's considerable efforts in the areas of environmental stewardship and climate initiatives. So Rob, welcome.
Thank you, Karen. Hello. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you. You know, Rob, let me start out by giving a bit of context here. Portugal has 475,000 vineyards, acres of vineyard, and yet it's only a fourth the size of California. So it's an area very carpeted in vines. And what's important about that is that many of these vineyards are based on indigenous varieties. I think there are something like 250 indigenous varieties in Portugal, many of which were originally Phoenician in origin or Anatolian in origin. Phoenicia is essentially modern day Lebanon, Anatolia, modern day Turkey. But my point is going to be that these are really grape varieties that the larger world knows very little about. So my first question to you is, on the one hand, all of these indigenous varieties are real viticultural assets. On the other hand, though, they've kept Portuguese wine a bit insular and unknown. Do you think that's the case?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that Portuguese wine on the international stage still has a lot of growing to do in terms of establishing ourselves as more than just the producers of port, Madeira, and maybe Matilde Rosé. Maybe a generation ago, we were known for those products. So I think it's a challenge, but it's also an amazing asset for us as a country. We've got this rich wine producing heritage. And at a time where many wine lovers are looking for new and exciting wine styles and varietals that they may not have heard of, some of the famous international varietals, allied to this amazing boom that we're having of tourism, means that I feel that at the moment the world is discovering Portuguese wines, and it's a very exciting time to be producing them.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I have to say that even if you don't ever go to Portugal, when you live in the United States and you begin to explore these dry table wines, I really think that most people are just, wow, I've never had a flavor like this before. The flavors of the wines are extremely unique, absolutely delicious, but and the wines are, for the most part, a steal. They're not expensive. So I don't know, you got to charge more, I think, because it's a flavor discovery that I've seen it. I see it all the time with students. They're like, oh my God, I had no idea wine could taste like this.
Yeah, well, that's fantastic to hear you say that. We have this rich heritage of these indigenous varietals. I think it's fair to say that a lot of the famous in Portugal wines from the past 50 years have been blends. And the current generation of winemakers are really beginning to play with single varietal wines and showcasing the expressiveness and character of individual varietals and how they express themselves in different regions. So we're going to talk about the Douro wines, and that has a specific characteristic, the wines from the north of Portugal. But you have this generation since the late 90s of Portuguese winemakers, ourselves included, who have just really grabbed this with both hands and are demonstrating creativity and pride. I think there's a lot of pride in what we have to show the world. And it's great to hear your endorsement, because I think the wines they deserve that pride, because they do have a lot to offer.
Yeah. Before we start tasting your wines, Rob, I want to clarify one thing, because I think some people do have a misconception that Portugal is famous for port, and then whatever grapes are left over that didn't make it into a great port kind of get used for these very basic table wines, most of which are just consumed in cafes in Portugal. I mean, I remember when I was writing the first wine Bible, I kind of thought that, because it sort of makes sense, but that is not the case, right?
Absolutely not. So, I mean, if you think about the main Portuguese wine regions that people might have heard of, you have Alentejo in the south, which with the Douro is those are the big two. Obviously, there's no port produced in the Alentejo, and there's some fantastic wines. Then you have Vinho Verde in the north, the green wines. You have Douro and Bairrada. So all these regions have centuries of wine production, nothing to do with port. And even in the Douro region, where it is true that about half of the region's grapes go towards port, the other half, and we're a high quality production region, so there's not that much, sort of lower quality production going on. Half of our grapes are used in the production of dry wines, still wines. And on top of that, often the plots that produce the best grapes for port are not the plots that produce the best grapes for still wine. So we have this amazing opportunity to produce what we believe are two world-class wines from the same valley, from the same vineyards.
Very important. All right, well, let's dive in, because I've got a lot of questions about these wines. We're going to start with your ALTANO. Let me hold this up to the camera. This is a 2020 Douro White. This is a blend, but is it a blend or is it a field blend? And in that answer, if you could explain a little bit about why there are so many field blends to this day in Portugal.
Great question. So in short, this is not a field blend. This is a wine that is blended in the winery. Usually we ferment individual varietals alone and then blend after the harvest, after the vintage, as is the case with this wine. In Portugal, there are a lot of field blends because, like many wine producing regions, we have a lot of growers who sell their grapes to producers. And typically, if you're a farmer who's trying to manage their risk in terms of the growing season, what a lot of farmers would do in the past, and it's changing now, but they would plant a block with multiple varietals. Often these are people with small holdings. And so if you have a year where one varietal is particularly susceptible to that year's conditions, you know that in the round, you're going to kind of come out with decent production and you'll be able to sell that to a producer, a house like Symington. So I think that was one of the big reasons why, even before, back in the day, there was no such thing as kind of varietals. You'd go to the nursery and you would just take a bunch of baby vines and you plant them, and there was a whole mix. And so that richness does bring some really interesting wines. Our approach with this wine is a little bit more surgical. We know which varietals we want to blend to achieve a given style. So we really seek out those different white grapes and blend them after the harvest.
And, we should add, by the way, that what you've just described about field blends has been true in many other European countries as well, especially Spain and Italy, southern France, maybe not in Germany, where Riesling dominated, or in the north of France. But it's a very Mediterranean idea to field blend wines. So for the ALTANO, one of the things that I remember being shocked about several years ago when I began tasting dry white wines, right? Because I thought, okay, Portugal, dry reds, I can see how that would make sense. But dry whites, it's a hot place. I mean, it's a hot place like Napa Valley, where I am right now, is a hot place. So probably the whites will be a little kind of out of focus, a little heavy, a little amorphous. Boy, was I wrong, right? The whites are very precise. And it was explained to me that over time, Portuguese varieties have, in a sense, learned to hold on to their acidity. Can you talk to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we in Portugal this year, we've had a year, it sounds like similar conditions to Napa, and the heat is extreme. And what's incredible is we're still able to produce wines with freshness, wines with acidity. Although on climatic front, we are heading into uncharted territory at the moment. So we're hoping that what has been shown up till now, which is this incredible adaptability. So these are varietals that if they did come from Phoenicia, have been here for long enough to be like, okay, so this is Portugal, this is how I ripen. I do think we have one factor in the Douro, which is really important for people to understand, which is we have massive differentials of altitude. So we are the world's largest region of mountainous vineyard. Mountain vineyard is basically defined by slopes of more than 30 degrees incline. And so what that means is we are a red grape region. I'd say roughly 90% of vineyards and grapes in the Douro are red. But we do have this 10%, which is white varietals. And increasingly, companies like ourselves are actually deliberately planting white in privileged spots up at 500 and even 600 meters above sea level, where we get a much bigger night to day range of differential of temperature. We get cool nights, and we get these grapes, these white grapes that preserve acidity for particularly for the dry wines, but also for the white ports, which is a significant minority of port production. So, you know, and the proof is in the glass, and it is incredible what freshness and tropical notes, but acidity and poise. And this is not what you might call a fine wine. This is an accessible, entry-level, everyday drinker, certainly in my family. And it packs a real punch. It's got a lot to offer.
It absolutely does. This wine is, again, we're tasting the ALTANO white wine from the Douro. Let me just hold this up again. I cannot believe that this wine is about $15. That is pretty surprising, because not only is it delicious, but I think I read on the text sheet that it's about 6% acidity, excuse me, get that word out there, 6% acidity, which, by the way, for people listening, watching, is almost twice what a California Chardonnay would be. So this wine is very cooling. You know, Doug just wrote in, hi Doug, an old friend of mine, and asked what changes are taking place though, other than planting. You've just mentioned one, planting at higher altitudes. What other kinds of changes are taking place to sort of keep in step with global warming?
I mean, there's a huge amount, and us as a family, but also the entire region, is very much got our eyes open to this challenge. It's not new. I think we're heading into new territory because we haven't seen conditions like this, but we've been aware of this, like the world has, for decades. And so Symington has been conducting research into the impacts of climate changes in the vineyard and in our wines for about 15 to 20 years. One of the main initiatives that we've been doing, which actually touches on the two wines that we're going to taste after this, but I'll tell you now, which is we've been studying different varietals that have fallen out of fashion in the Douro for whatever reason, usually because they're lower yielding, so the farmers privilege varietals which will give them more fruit. And we're doing this for two reasons. We've got two grape variety libraries planted at different locations in the valley, about 30 red and 20 white varietals. And what we're trying to understand is which of these varietals have the capacity to withstand high temperatures and low rainfall, more so than the varietals that we're using today. And this is a multi-year experiment to try and understand, okay, which are the winners that we could possibly be planting now that in the 2030s and 2040s could really help us, adapt, basically.
Mm. It occurs to me that when you have a situation like that, right? And we were just speaking of field blends. Here's where a field blend is sort of also a marketing asset, because what people are buying is Douro White and your reputation as the Symington family, as opposed to buying a Rinto or one Portuguese variety that now you decide, but it doesn't do very well in a warming climate. You're able to change perhaps the makeup of the varieties in order to achieve the same style of a wine.
That's absolutely right. I never thought about it in as clear terms, but you're spot on. This has already happened with, I know we're talking about dry wines, but with our vintage ports in the last 10 years, we've brought some varietals into the blend that my grandfather would never have even recognized. And it's a necessity. It's evolution, it's creativity, and it's responding to the challenges of the time.
Yeah. So if you're tasting along with us, I'll be curious to hear what people think. For me, it's hot. The lead variety here is Viosinho. Am I saying that correctly?
Viosinho.
All right. Are you showing off? Come on. Well, I rest my case because wine is the absolute only entity in the world where you're expected to have, a command of Portuguese, French, German, Italian, Spanish. I mean, you have to, I don't know, only a few people can pronounce everything perfectly.
No, it's not really fair, is it?
It isn't. But the wine itself is so fascinating to me because I would say, I know this is sort of internally referential, but it reminds me a little bit of Albarino. It reminds me a little bit of Sauvignon Blanc. It reminds me a little bit of Italian Vernaccia, all of those sort of fresh, aromatic whites that never get put in oak. I don't think there's any oak here. And that, just come at you with a through line of purity.
Absolutely. The other thing that I think might be interesting for your listeners and people tasting along is, as well as altitude, we have an east-west dynamic going on in the Douro, where some of the principal plots for this wine come from the area closest to the Atlantic. So this is a region that gets almost often double the rainfall of the areas to the east near the Spanish border. So there's a massive difference in terroir just within this demarcated region. And so those aptly citrus notes that you describe are much more reflective of a more Atlantic, a more coastal climate. And it is incredible that we have a lot of tropical notes here as well, sort of rich aromatics, but some of the varietals that give you that freshness are the Viosinho, which is famous in Portugal for being a varietal that even in hot summers can give you acidity.
And if you're planning on picking up a bottle of this weekend and you're a person who likes minerality in wine, you won't be disappointed on that score either, because there's a wonderful little minerally salty edge here that adds to that cooling, refreshing character that we were talking about earlier. Let's go to the reds. ALTANO also makes and this is just called again, a Douro Red. This is the partner to the white wine. This is a 2018 vintage. These are the vintages on the market right now in the United States. So this is based on the traditional port grapes. And those grapes are pretty remarkable because here you have grapes that do translate well to dry table wine and work magnificently, obviously, for port, right?
Absolutely. I mean, this is one of the incredible developments in the Douro over the last 20 years. I'd say since the late 90s was this realization that there is a ready market for dry wines from the same vineyards that had been producing port for centuries. Allied with new generation of entrepreneurial winemakers saying, hey, why are we just producing port? We'd always produced these wines in the region, but typically for local consumption. And then there's this sense of like, we've got to start commercializing these. We've got to bring them to market. So we launched the first ALTANO, I think I'm right in saying in 99. So I was only 17 years old at the time, so I wasn't involved, but I certainly enjoyed being allowed to taste the first ones. And again, we've learned, we didn't know what we were doing at the beginning. We knew about port. And so it does take time to say, okay, when do you need to pick these grapes? Because you don't pick them at the same time as you do for your port. And so there's a whole process there of acquiring the knowledge and the confidence to go out to the market and say, we're really proud of this. Come and see what we've made.
Yeah. Not only are you proud of this, but it's important maybe to note that Bordeaux has now, as of 2019, allowed so-called supplemental varieties to be part of traditional Bordeaux blends in some Bordeaux wines, not all. And several of those varieties are Portuguese. So when Bordeaux starts planting the Douro's varieties, that's a real statement. And one of them, I think, is Touriga Nacional. This is Touriga Nacional, right? No, this is a field blend.
Correct. It's a blend, but it has a strong component of Nacional, roughly a third. So this is these days spoken about as possibly Portugal's, if not the finest red varietal, certainly one of the Premier League. And it's got it's a wine. It's a bit of a sort of a blockbuster of a varietal because it brings you freshness and structure. It brings fantastic aromatics. It's relatively early ripening. And it's been the backbone of port for decades. So this is a strong component in this wine, in this organic red, which is a blend, and is a reflection of what Bordeaux were looking for when they were looking for two things. They were looking for varietals that could withstand climatic changes and quality. And, right. And with Touriga Nacional, you have both of those things.
What always impresses me about Touriga Nacional, and what I'm tasting in this ALTANO right now too, is, for those of us who are in the States, when we taste a very luscious wine, a wine that has some gravitas, a wine that has some body on the palate, that usually comes with sometimes a steel door of tannin, right? You're just like, okay, here it is. Oh, yes, full body, lots of lusciousness, but man, right in there is a massive amount of tannin. Portugal is one of the only places I know where you can get that kind of richness in a red, but without any tannic, edge, without any tannic, real seriously difficult punch.
Yeah, absolutely. I think our climate helps on that, as well as the blend. There are some Portuguese reds which need more time in bottle to soften the tannins, but I think as the winemakers have got more and more on top of their terroir and confident, that our wines are increasingly approachable. Actually, the same thing has been said for young vintage ports of a generation ago. You couldn't touch the thing until it was 15 to 20 years old, and these days, it's not that they're flabby and lacking in structure, it's just that it's incredibly polished and rounded and accessible. And obviously, we're deliberately trying to achieve a style with this ALTANO Organic Red that is approachable, that doesn't need years in the bottle to soften. Yeah. And so there's red fruits, that generosity that is coming through, but it does have that undergirding of structure without feeling like you need to kind of go and brush your teeth afterwards because you just had a tannin shower.
Yeah. we taste a lot of wine around here in this office, and at $3 a glass, I don't think we've tasted such a delicious wine at that price in a long, long time, maybe 10 years ago.
That's good.
Rob, this wine deserves to cost more. I'm going to say it. All right. And now we're going to go to the QUINTA do ATAÍDE. Okay, you didn't make this one easy. Let me hold it up.
QUINTA do ATAÍDE, yeah.
ATAÍDE, 3 syllables, ATAÍDE, right?
Exactly.
So QUINTA, we should say, right, means wine farm, or in fact, just the word means farm. So here you're getting a little bit more serious. This is a specific estate. Describe it for us, because in reading a little bit about it, I realized, oh, this is a very specific terroir.
Absolutely. I think it's really exciting to now taste this wine, having tasted the first two for various reasons. The terroir, the location of QUINTA do ATAÍDE is near the Spanish border, so it's in the hottest, driest region, but it's just up from the Douro River. So you've got if anyone's been to the Douro or seen photos, you have these incredible terraced hillsides, which is what our region is. But this property is actually up slightly north of the valley on a geographic fault line. So it's flat. It's flat, and it has a different soil composition to the valley itself, which is predominantly schist. So we have more granite here, and we have various alluvial. It's an old floodplain, so we have various other soil types. But basically, it's a different Douro. So this terroir and the topography is the main reason why this is a 100% organically farmed vineyard, because the Douro terroir is extremely challenging to farm. It's predominantly done by hand and small tractors, and organic farming requires a huge amount of labor, more than conventionally farmed vineyards. And so when we acquired this property, we had an amazing opportunity to plant and grow. The vineyards were already there, but to transition to organic viticulture. So for a period, this was the largest organic vineyard in the whole of Portugal, until recently our friends and colleagues at Esporão transitioned their entire national farming to organic, for which we applaud them. It's a fantastic step. So yes, it's a different terroir. And this wine in particular is a parcel wine. It comes from one plot, and that plot is entirely Touriga Nacional. So it's an interesting representation of what the Douro can produce from one plot with one varietal, with organic farming. And this wine is 7 years old. So this is a wine that can go, we believe, for many years, and has got a lot of aging still to come, if you so wanted.
Yeah, you know what is, well, before I make my comment, let me just have Teresa's question answered. She, as you were speaking, she asked if actually all 3 of the wines are farmed organically, come from grapes farmed organically.
So the 2 reds are, because they are 100% Symington farmed grapes, and the one the ALTANO Organic that we just tasted is from the same valley as the QUINTA do ATAÍDE. We have other holdings in that region. The white is not. It's from minimum intervention vineyards, but not certified organic, primarily because we buy from a lot of growers in privileged locations in the valley, and for various reasons to do with scale and traditional farming techniques, some of these growers do not have organic certification. So no, that one is not.
All right. Let's talk about the flavor of this wine, because, you know, when you say, I don't know, Merlot, Cabernet, Zinfandel, Pinot Noir, almost any wine drinker in the US would have a conception of what that is. Touriga Nacional is a different puppy, so to speak. One of the things that I notice is, you know, a lot of, because I'm here in California, maybe a lot of California wines are very fruity, in fact, when you talk to winemakers, they often complement the fruitiness in their own wines. Like, ooh, taste this fruit, like all that's cherry and strawberry and grenadine and all of that. This wine really has this beautiful thick mid palate. So it's really, it's very satisfying in the mouth. But it is more, to me, it's a little bit more earthy. It reminds me more in flavor, not in texture, but in flavor, it reminds me more of Bordeaux than it does of, let's say, Napa Valley Cabernet, because it's not just a basket of raspberries and things like that. They're harder to describe, these very earthy flavors.
Yeah, well, it's always so interesting to get reflections from people who aren't from the Douro, and well, someone like yourself, you literally wrote the wine Bible, so you have a world of references and experience and examples to compare to. So it's super interesting to hear that reflection. I mean, we are a hot region, so you do get richness and generosity in our wines, certainly our reds, and we try to make wines that are true to that terroir. Touriga Nacional is such an amazing varietal because it brings you aromatics and kind of notes that are more reflective of the wild scrubland of the Douro, not just the vineyard. So you get rock rose and you get wild mint, and you also get kind of bergamot and licorice, and yeah, it's hard to put in a box. You do get those plum and cherry notes, but it's not a fruit explosion in a way that it feels like that's just dominating the glass. So yeah, I just love hearing your thoughts. And I mean, I agree. I think you can see why sommeliers and those in the know around the world have been getting increasingly excited about Touriga Nacional over recent years.
Yeah. Because interestingly enough, one of the hallmarks of greatness in wine is that a wine can't merely be fruity. I mean, it is from grapes, but if it just tastes like, I don't know, a cherry cupcake or something, it's just not a very sophisticated kind of flavor that you want to spend the night with, conversing over a really nice long dinner with. It's often those characteristics that are harder to describe that keep us more kind of intellectually galvanized by the wine. And my sympathies go out to whoever wrote the text sheet for this wine, because it would be hard. It's hard to put it into words. And I'm a person who lays awake at night trying to put wine into words. So I don't know. It's so delicious, though. It's both delicious and sophisticated. And it is not $15, we should add, lest anyone was like, oh, I think I want that last wine, and they're all $15. No. This is a single estate and a plot within the estate, which is Vinha do Arco, right? That is the specific vineyard.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
That's the name of the vineyard, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's important to just clarify that this property has two reds. One is the estate wine, which we're not tasting now, which is also organic, and it's from a variety of plots. And then we have the single varietal, single plot wine, which is the top of that. It's a small range of two wines. Yeah. I think, what was I going to say? Reflecting back what you were talking about, I mean, when you grow up in a port family, you get schooled in what makes a great port wine, and people often who don't know much about the port categories say, well, that's a sweet wine, that's just super sweet. And what you grow up learning in port is, well, actually the best ports have this incredible balance between the sugar, the acidity, and the tannic structure. And it's only when you get those three in harmony that's what makes your mouth salivate when you actually taste an amazing young vintage port. And now saying back to this wine, you achieve the same thing here. If it was just purely rich fruits and sweetness, because of course wine is sweet, it wouldn't be nearly as satisfying and pleasurable. But because it has that freshness, the minerality, and the acidity, it is a wine you could spend an evening with. You could definitely have more than one glass if you were so disposed. And yeah, it's just really interesting to hear your feelings about the wine.
Mm. I suppose being from a leading port family, also it was probably part of the thread of the fabric of the family that one of the best things a wine can do is to age a really long time. Right? I mean, we know the whole sort of ideology of the British drinking when they went to Cambridge and Oxford, drinking 50-year-old vintage ports with their professors, or the giving of children a pipe of port when the newborn was born. So today, I think one of the interesting things about a wine, and it's important to know when a wine can age, even if you don't age it, because it's categorically a good sign, right? So even if you have the intention of aging it for as long as it took to get home from the store, fine. But the fact that it can age is a sign in favor of its complexity and sophistication.
Absolutely, I think that's a really good definition. We get a lot of feedback from people saying of our top reds, the ones that we're really trying to make an amazing wine from the Douro. We get people saying, I love this wine, but you've released it way too young. And obviously you always have that tension between the commercial perspective and what you would do if it was just about the wine. And typically we will hold back and release mature bottlings of our top reds. But we've had these experiences recently where someone will find a bottle of ALTANO from the early noughties, which the wine was never meant to age, and say, well, let's just open it and see what's going on here. And then we just get completely blown away that a wine that was a $15 wine is incredible. And we're like, hang on, what's going on here? Yeah. But I guess if I pick on your line, it's like, well, it's a good sign, even if you made it to be drunk young.
That's absolutely so right. Let's talk for a minute about, there's a character in this wine that is a little bit of spiciness. And for me, it's sort of evocative of, I don't know, just sort of general, what I might call Moroccan spices, cumin and cardamom and dark spices. And yet, I think the wine is aged in barriques, and I think you even fermented part of it in barrique, right? And that's very hard to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what we're trying to do with producing a wine like this is give maximum expression and ferment in different ways, so that when you then come back to the blend, you've aged it, you've fermented and aged, and some of it's in stainless steel, some of it's in barrels, some of it's in new oak, some of it's in second or third year oak. And what we're trying to get is harmony. That's the objective. Our wines are hot climate wines. You get some people saying, well, the trend's all towards light wines and lower alcohol. It's like, well, nice if we were in Oregon, but we're in the Douro. So some of that heat and that spice and that pepperiness comes from the actual terroir and the vineyard, and some of it comes from the production process and what we're trying to achieve in the winery and with the aging. And to be honest about, you're tasting a certain amount of heat. It's not unpleasant, and that's reflective of where we're from.
Yeah. We have a question coming in from Nancy. Speaking of aging, she is asking, do you use longer corks in bottles that you expect to age?
There's definitely, ask any wine producer about their corks and you better get ready for a thesis. But, we're lucky we're in Portugal, where a huge amount of the world's cork supply comes from. So we have a very close relationship with multiple cork producers. And inevitably they grade different production lots, and they set aside certain corks for fine wines for aging, and others for everyday wines, which often have a cork agglomerate, which is cheaper, but can often serve a better function for a wine that's meant to be drunk within a couple of years. And yes, typically Wines which are intended for aging will have a slightly longer cork. They will be whole corks. It's a single piece. It's from a bit of cork that came off the tree that grew for at least 12 years to get that thickness. And more than the length, although length is important, it's the quality. It's we're looking for the highest grade lots of the best trees, which we know will guarantee high levels of quality and low levels of risk.
Well, here's the ATAÍDE.
There you go.
The QUINTA do ATAÍDE, which is, as you can see, a little bit longer. But I'm with you there. I think it's the quality of the cork. Sorry, everybody who puts wine in those plugs, plastic plugs, purple in color or something. I'm like, oh, all right. Let's see. What else Megan is writing in, saying she's headed to Porto in a few weeks. Megan, my friend, don't you need your personal associate to, wine educator to come with you, although you need no education. And Paul Meunier, a man who taught me a lot about port, is saying he will fix you up, which I am sure is the case because there's no American who knows more about port than Paul. So let's see, Teresa, this is a very long comment that she's made in support of how much she thinks Touriga Nacional is just one of the world's great varieties. Well, Rob, I hope we can see you again in the future. Before you go, though, because I do think I hope we're going to see more dry Portuguese table wines on our tables here in the US. But can you just mention a couple of last things about your environmental work? In particular, some of our viewers may have heard of the Porto protocol, which I believe you were instrumental in. Can you describe that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, starting from first principles, we're a wine family. We think in terms of generations, and we rely on the climate for our product. So if we're not paying attention to this and concerned about it, we're completely asleep at the wheel. I hope to be working well into the second half of this century. I'm that age, I've got a lot of years ahead of me. And this is a big challenge. So we take this very seriously. The Porto Protocol was a fantastic pledge that emerged out of two climate change conferences in Porto in 2018 and 2019, organized by our colleagues and friends at Taylorsport and Taylor Flaggate. Actually, we had one ex-president of the US and one ex-vice president. So we had Barack Obama speak at the first, and Al Gore gave an incredibly rousing speech at the second one. And this was essentially thought leadership of what the wine trade can do to respond to climate. We are very proud to have been founding members of something called International Wineries for Climate Action, IWCAWine.org, actually founded by Jackson Family Wines from California and Torres from Spain. And this is an association of wine producers seeking to set the standards for decarbonization in the wine sector. So we're operating on a lot of fronts. Wine is a small drop in the ocean on a global scale, but we kind of punch above our weight in terms of our resonance as an agricultural product. And we feel that we have a responsibility to do our bit in terms of decarbonizing and using our voices to call for wider action. Because, like I say, I have two young girls born in 16 and 17, and I want them to be able to enjoy the beautiful Douro Valley and making wines here like I have. So it's important. We're working on it. And unfortunately, many people around the wine world are as equally committed as we are.
Yep. And to that we say, thank you, and may you continue in those important efforts. Rob, thank you so very much. We've just so enjoyed these wines, and we know our viewers will as well. So cheers, my friend. Next time in Portugal.
See you soon. Thank you for having me. Cheers.